Hey guys, tonight we drift into the glow of gas lamps that never quite reach the corners of the room, leaving everything just a little bit shadowy, a little bit uncertain. You imagine yourself stepping into a Victorian parlour, the heavy drapes pulled tight, the fire spitting sparks into the grate, and the voices around you hushed but persistent. They're not whispering about politics or the economy, though both are in upheaval. No. The whispers are about women, about what makes them pure, and about how society can possibly test something that is, by nature, invisible. You probably won't survive this evening with your sanity intact, because the rules are endless, the stakes are impossible, and the contradictions are dizzying. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step deeper into the parlour, the carpet muffling your tread, and you catch the faint scent of coal smoke mixing with perfume. This is Victorian England, where appearances mean everything. The very glow of the gaslight seems to remind you that the world is watching, and no detail of your behaviour goes unnoticed. A dropped glove, a smile held a second too long, a glance out of place, all of these things could feed the rumour mill. And in a society obsessed with purity, rumours are weapons sharper than any knife. One fact that stands out. Historians often note how the Victorian era was marked by unprecedented levels of social surveillance. Entire communities seem to function as amateur detectives, analysing each other's behaviour with a zeal that makes modern neighbourhood gossip look like a casual hobby. And unlike today, there was no refuge in online anonymity. Your reputation was carved into the stone of local memory. As you settle into an armchair, you realise purity isn't really about anatomy just yet. It's about performance. It's about how you carry yourself. Even a sneeze in the wrong context could be read as a sign of impropriety. That's not a joke. At least one etiquette manual warned women against blowing their noses too loudly in public, as it was considered unseemly. Imagine then the pressure of existing in such a world where the sound of your sniffle might be weighed against your moral fibre. A quirky tidbit surfaces: gaslight itself, the very thing illuminating this parlour, was infamous for making people paranoid. Some complained of dizziness, nausea, even hallucinations. You can't help but smirk. Maybe those suspicions about a neighbour's daughter weren't divine insight at all, but just the side effect of sitting too close to the lamp. Still, the stories spread. The whispers tonight are about a young woman seen walking in the park with a gentleman alone. Scandalous. The park, you think, seems harmless enough. But in this age, purity is fragile, as if it were a porcelain teacup balanced on the edge of a table. A single misstep, real or imagined, could send it crashing down. You sip an imaginary cup of tea, which of course tastes faintly of soot, and listen as the talk swirls around you. You hear phrases like unsullied, innocent, and virtuous tossed about, as if they were scientific categories, as if you could test them with a ruler or a microscope. Historians still argue whether Victorians truly believed in these rigid purity standards, or whether the whole charade was more about keeping social order intact. After all, purity wasn't just about personal virtue, it was tied to property, inheritance, and social standing. A family's honour was balanced precariously on the virtue of its daughters, and so entire generations were trained to watch, to judge, and to whisper. The fire crackles louder, almost as if it agrees with the gossip, and you can sense the pressure mounting on women in this room. Imagine knowing that your entire future, your chance at marriage, your financial security, your very place in society, rests on whether or not your neighbours approve of how you sip your tea. The absurdity is almost funny, except it's also devastating. You glance again at the gaslight flickering against the wallpaper, and wonder if the room itself is testing you, observing you, waiting for you to step even slightly out of line. That's the unsettling truth of Victorian purity culture. It turned every moment of a woman's life into an exam, and every bystander into a judge. And so you sit, shoulders heavy, listening to the whispers that never stop, realizing that in this world even silence can be damning and every glow of gaslight might reveal you more than you wish. You lean forward in that same parlour, the glow of the gaslight tugging at the edges of your vision, and you notice how the conversation shifts. It isn't just whispers anymore, it's a recitation of rules, as if each guest carries a little manual of do's and don'ts tucked in their waistcoat or reticule. Courtship in the Victorian world wasn't a fluttering, spontaneous romance. It was more like a chess game where every move was observed, catalogued, and quietly judged. Picture yourself stepping out into the garden, a place that smells of damp earth and roses climbing the trellis, and there, a courting couple. But wait, there's never just two, always three, sometimes four. A chaperone sits nearby, knitting or pretending to read, but really keeping an eagle eye on every exchanged glance. The couple might lower their voices, but the rustle of skirts and the crunch of gravel under boots betray every movement. Here's a hard historical fact. Victorian etiquette books insisted that a young lady must never be alone with a gentleman unless he was family. Even walking a short distance without a chaperone could damage her reputation. It wasn't only about protecting her from impropriety, but also from the appearance of impropriety, which in many cases was considered just as damning. And then comes a quirky tidbit. Some particularly inventive families employed younger siblings as official little spies during courtship. Imagine dragging your 9-year-old brother along to every meeting with your suitor, only for him to run back and gleefully report to your parents how long you held hands. Not exactly a recipe for candlelit romance. You stroll past them, the evening air cool, and hear the girls' laughter, a little too loud, perhaps. The chaperone raises her eyebrows, storing that memory away for later. You realize how suffocating this must feel. Every giggle, every flutter of eyelashes, every shared book of poetry is logged in some invisible ledger of morality. It's worth pausing on this. Historians still argue whether these elaborate courtship rules were really enforced as strictly as the manuals suggested, or whether they were ideals written down but selectively ignored. After all, real human beings, yes, even Victorians, were just as capable of sneaking away for a stolen kiss as anyone else. But the threat of being caught, or even being suspected, was enough to keep most people in line. Back in the parlour, a gentleman clears his throat and tells a story about how his cousin's engagement nearly collapsed when the bride-to-be was spotted speaking privately with another man at a bookshop. The horror. Never mind that the man was apparently asking her opinion on whether Charles Dickens had lost his touch. The rumour spiralled, the family panicked, and only a hastily arranged intervention preserved the match. The rules extended even to correspondence. Letters between lovers were often read aloud to parents before they were allowed to pass. Picture trying to write something heartfelt, maybe even slightly flirtatious, knowing that your beloved's father would be scrutinizing every comma, no pressure at all. And here's where the humour seeps in. Some etiquette guides went so far as to caution young ladies not to use too many exclamation marks lest they seem overly excitable. Imagine being judged immoral for your punctuation. You can almost hear the scratching of a quill pen, followed by the stern voice of a parent muttering, "Too many dashes, surely this girl has no self-control." The structure of courtship meant that purity was tested not by doctors or priests yet, but by social ritual. The rules themselves were the exam. A man who respected them proved his seriousness. A woman who obeyed them proved her virtue. And everyone else, from servants to cousins to nosy neighbours, acted as proctors in this endless test. As you lean back in your chair, you can't help but smile at the absurdity. You picture a young couple trying to walk side by side on a narrow path while the chaperone huffs along right behind them, practically stepping on their heels. You imagine the sly glances exchanged, the stolen moments when a hand brushes another hand, tiny rebellions that, in their quietness, felt monumental. And you realize that for Victorians, purity wasn't only a moral question, it was also entertainment, the gossip, the speculation, the endless commentary on who followed the rules and who didn't, This was the Netflix of the 19th century. No streaming service required, just a keen pair of eyes and a knack for exaggeration. So the rules of courtship become clear in your mind. Never alone, always watched, every move measured. You let the thought settle like coal dust in your lungs, heavy and inescapable. Purity here is not a private trait but a public performance, judged by the endless jury of society. And the jury never adjourns. You stay in that garden a little longer, your shoes sinking slightly into the damp grass, and you notice how small objects begin to take on an outsized weight. Courtship is not only about conversation or glances, it's also about tokens, engagement gifts, sentimental keepsakes. Even the tiniest trinket could become a kind of unspoken purity test. A young woman pulls a lock of her hair from a locket, showing it shyly to her suitor. He, in turn, offers a ring, not just any ring, but one engraved with initials or inscribed with a verse from Tennyson. These objects weren't just decorative, they were proof, a visible sign that two people had entered into a promise. And everyone around them would examine these tokens as if they were courtroom evidence. A hard historical fact here, the Victorians were notorious for their elaborate engagement rituals. Rings, hair jewellery, and even pressed flowers exchanged between couples often ended up being displayed, sometimes in drawing rooms as a way of announcing and verifying the union. It was less romantic gesture and more public statement of purity and intention. And then comes the quirky tidbit. Hair jewellery was so popular that entire shops specialised in it. You could buy necklaces woven out of a sweetheart's hair, brooches with tiny curls under glass, even watch chains braided from locks. You imagine strolling into one of these shops looking at rows of hair that once belonged to strangers and wondering whether this was romance or a creepy Victorian version of arts and crafts. Back in the parlour, you hear an aunt exclaim that a certain young lady had returned an engagement ring after a broken promise. The implication was clear. If the ring was returned, then perhaps her purity had been in question. Some even believed the very act of giving back such tokens marked a woman as tainted, as if she'd failed an invisible exam. And this is where historians still argue. Were these tokens really about love? Or were they just another way for society to control women's reputations? A ring could symbolize devotion, yes, but it could also become a chain of suspicion. A lock of hair might seem sweet, but what if it ended up in the wrong hands? Say, an angry rival or a jealous neighbour? You picture a young man holding a pressed flower in a book, and you almost laugh. Imagine the drama if someone discovered it. Whispers that he'd plucked it from the wrong girl's bouquet, rumours spiralling out of control, reputations balanced on the fragile stem of a daisy. Even letters, folded carefully and tied with ribbon, were treated like purity tokens. Parents sometimes demanded to read them, and courts occasionally accepted them as evidence of a woman's virtue or lack of it in legal disputes. Imagine your private doodle of hearts being read aloud to a room full of strangers, dissected like a forensic clue. It's as if every scribble carried the power to condemn or absolve you. You can almost feel the weight of those tokens pressing on your palm. A cold ring, a brittle flower, a lock of hair that smells faintly of lavender oil. They are delicate things, but in the Victorian world they could decide a lifetime. And there's humour here too. You can picture a poor young woman frantically braiding hair into jewellery while her suitor complains that he's bald and can't quite return the favour. Or imagine the awkwardness of explaining why you own 3 different locks of hair, each from a different beloved. The tokens become their own little tests. If a woman offered them too freely, she risked her purity being questioned. If she withheld them, she risked appearing cold. There was no winning, just balancing endlessly on a tightrope where each step was judged. So as you leave the garden and step back into the warm parlour, you realise that even love itself had been turned into an exam paper. And every token, whether a flower pressed into a book or a locket hung on a chain, was just another question in the long, exhausting test of Victorian purity. The fire crackles in the grate as you sink deeper into that parlour chair, and the whispers gather strength. Now the talk has shifted to a darker phrase, one that rolls off Victorian tongues with a mix of dread and relish: the fallen woman. The words carry more weight than the heaviest velvet curtain, and they hang in the air like smoke that refuses to clear. A fallen woman, you soon learn, isn't necessarily guilty of some dramatic act. She doesn't have to be caught in bed with a man or run away in the night. She only has to step slightly outside the endless maze of rules, seen unchaperoned, fallen, accept a gift without her parents' approval, fallen. Even rumors of impropriety, no matter how absurd, could plunge her from respectability into disgrace. A firm historical fact. In Victorian England, the stigma of being labelled a fallen woman was devastating. Charitable institutions, novels, and moral lectures all reinforced the idea that once a woman had lost her virtue, she could never reclaim it. It was a permanent stain, one that followed her like a shadow, and society adored pointing it out. You pause, noticing a curious tidbit. The term fallen was often applied even to women who were victims. A girl seduced by an older man, or worse, assaulted, was lumped into the same category as someone who chose a lover freely. The nuance didn't matter. The purity test had no answer key, only failures. Historians still argue whether this obsession with fallen women reflected genuine moral panic, or whether it served as a convenient tool for controlling women's behavior. Some say the trope was exaggerated by novels and sermons, while others insist it truly haunted daily life. Either way, the fear was real enough to shape how women walked, talked, and even breathed in public. You picture a young woman returning home after dusk, her cheeks flushed from walking too quickly. Her neighbor peers out from behind lace curtains, the whisper already forming. Why was she out so late? Who was she with? By morning, the rumor has grown legs. By evening, her reputation dangles by a thread, all from a 10-minute walk. Literature thrived on this drama. Writers like Thomas Hardy and Charles Dickens spun tales of heroines undone by whispers. In Tess of the D'Urbervilles, Tess is punished relentlessly for what's done to her, not what she chooses. It's a story that feels absurdly unfair, yet deeply accurate to the time. And here's a lighter aside. The Victorians even moralized about fruit. Eating an apple in public, for example, was sometimes considered suggestive. Imagine being branded fallen because you bit into the wrong Granny Smith at the wrong moment. You can almost laugh at it until you remember how serious the consequences could be. In the parlour, an older matron tells the tale of her cousin's friend who was ruined simply because a gentleman kissed her hand a little too ardently at a dance. The cousin moved away, the engagement collapsed, and the girl spent her days embroidering handkerchiefs for church bazaars, forever marked by a single rumour. And you realise the fallen woman trope wasn't just a warning, it was entertainment. People whispered these stories with the same excitement you might hear in someone discussing the latest scandalous TV series. Except here, the characters weren't fictional. They were neighbours, relatives, and acquaintances, their lives made fodder for the endless moral theatre of society. You feel the weight of it pressing down, the impossible purity test where no one explained the rules clearly, but everyone relished pointing out when you failed. It was a society in love with the drama of downfall, a society that pretended to value virtue but secretly enjoyed the spectacle of ruin. So you sit back, tea cooling on the saucer, and realize that in this world a woman's reputation didn't fall because of what she did. It fell because others decided it had, and once it slipped, it almost never rose again. You wander through the dimly lit hallways of memory, imagining the houses where these tests of virtue were carried out, and you notice how meticulous the Victorians were about the spaces themselves. Bedrooms weren't just for sleep, they were for observation. Curtains were tied back, mirrors angled, and chests carefully arranged so that every visitor could see that the room, and by extension the girl, was proper. You can almost feel the stiffness of the feathered mattress beneath the crisp linen, the faint scent of lavender that served both as comfort and deodorizer, because hygiene and reputation were inseparable. Here's a hard historical fact. In many upper-middle-class households, families employed governesses or matrons to supervise the young women constantly. These chaperones weren't just background figures, they were authorities tasked with ensuring behavior, dress, and even posture conformed to society's unyielding standards. Their eyes were everywhere, their judgment subtle but inescapable. And then comes the quirky tidbit. Some families went so far as to measure the angle at which a young lady held her fan. Too low, it implied coquettishness. Too high, it suggested pride or defiance. You can almost hear a mother muttering under her breath while squinting over her spectacles. That's 32 degrees, absolutely unacceptable. It's ridiculous, but somehow entirely plausible. Historians still argue whether these rituals were mainly symbolic or whether they had real consequences for social mobility. Some suggest the tests were performative, a kind of theatre of virtue meant to display propriety rather than assess it strictly. Others argue that the smallest deviation could result in social exile, lost dowries, or forced marriages. Imagine yourself observing a young girl sitting stiffly at her writing desk, quill poised above a sheet of paper. She's composing a thank you note for a modest gift, yet every letter, every flourish of ink might be judged. Too ornate, too casual, too expressive, each carries an unspoken risk. And while she writes, a chaperone leans slightly forward, notebook in hand, ready to record any perceived misstep. It's in this environment that so-called purity tests emerged, the subtle, pervasive methods for gauging a young woman's moral character. Some families used whispered interviews, private conversations where a girl might be asked probing questions about her feelings, her acquaintances, even her dreams. Others relied on small but telling behaviors, whether she lingered too long at a dance, laughed too freely, or accepted a gentleman's compliment with a hint of blush. And of course, there was the gossip network, the informal judiciary of neighbours and relatives. One misinterpreted smile could travel from drawing room to chapel to street corner in a matter of hours. A girl might find herself suddenly the subject of speculation, her every action filtered through the expectations of those who claimed to protect her. You almost chuckle at the absurdity. A young woman can't even tie her ribbon in peace without wondering if the angle of the bow will be deemed inappropriate. Meanwhile, her suitor anxiously rehearses polite phrases, fearful that a slip of the tongue will be interpreted as impropriety. The tiniest gestures have become tests, small trials that seem utterly disproportionate to the offence. And yet for all the rigidity, there is humour hiding in plain sight. You can picture a chaperone accidentally knocking over a vase while adjusting a girl's posture, and everyone pretending nothing happened because decorum forbade acknowledgement of accidents. Or perhaps a young gentleman practicing his bow in front of a mirror, only to trip spectacularly on a rug, producing a scene both mortifying and hilarious. The Victorian purity tests are as much about performance as principle. Every glance, every step, every word is scrutinized, catalogued, and interpreted. You realize that the entire household functions as both theatre and courtroom, where virtue is judged continuously and the cost of error is social invisibility, or worse, the ignominy of being labelled fallen. And as you lean back, imagining the velvet curtains, the feathered beds, and the tiny, scrutinized gestures, you sense the overwhelming pressure of being constantly observed. The air itself seems heavy, almost fragrant with judgment. And yet somewhere, in this rigid structure, moments of rebellion, or small, secret laughter, still thrive, hidden in corners no chaperone can see. The morning sun filters through lace curtains, casting intricate shadows across the polished floorboards, and you step quietly into the nursery of moral observation. Here, in these modestly adorned rooms, the purity tests continue, but now with tools a little more inventive. You notice the faint scent of rosewater and beeswax, mixed with something sharper, metallic perhaps, from the small instruments lined neatly on the dresser. It's a curious combination, comforting and unsettling at once, like peppermint tea with a hint of nail polish. A historical fact, Victorian society sometimes employed medical examinations as part of verifying a young woman's chastity, though these were far from standardized. Doctors or matrons might check for physical signs of innocence, guided by the prevailing, often pseudo-scientific beliefs of the day. The practice varied widely between families, regions, and social classes, But the underlying principle remained. Women's bodies were evidence, and evidence must be scrutinized. The quirky detail: some households relied on entirely homemade concoctions to test purity. One method involved applying a mixture of vinegar and rosewater to the skin. If the scent changed or the skin reacted, it was interpreted as proof of experience, or, in the euphemistic Victorian phrasing, matured interest. You can almost picture a young girl nervously dabbing the potion on her wrist, hoping that nothing drastic happens. Historians still argue whether these practices had any medical validity at all, or if they were merely performative, designed to satisfy parental anxiety and social expectations rather than truth. Some argue that the tests were more about control than actual verification, a way of asserting authority over a woman's emerging sexuality before society could judge her indiscretions. You imagine a matron perched on a chair, hands folded, eyes trained, ready to record the slightest misstep. The girl's hands tremble as she picks up a brush or a ribbon. Each motion is tiny, yet loaded with significance. Even a cough, a blush, or a hesitant glance could be noted, whispered about, or later used in judgment. And then there's the lighter side, the tiny absurdities hidden in the gravity. One method supposedly involved observing how a girl reacted to a mischievous household cat. If she showed too much excitement or tenderness, some observers deemed it a sign of immoderate emotion. You almost laugh at the image, a family cat blissfully unaware, unwittingly serving as an arbiter of virtue. In some cases, letters and diaries were confiscated or read with careful scrutiny. Notebooks, sketches, and small tokens of affection were analyzed for hidden meaning. You can picture a young woman doodling flowers in her diary, only to be asked later what each petal represents. Innocent observation, she might protest, but the matron's sharp gaze would not be fooled. And here's another quirky angle. There are records of families timing young women's sleep, believing that certain sleep patterns indicated moral character. Early risers were often praised for discipline, while those who lingered in bed too long were suspected of languid indulgence. Imagine your grandmother setting an alarm clock in the 1860s just to monitor propriety. Historians still debate the psychological impact of these routines. Some suggest they instilled fear, anxiety, and paranoia. Others argue they cultivated attentiveness, discipline, and a certain cunning necessary for navigating strict social norms. Either way, the tests were invasive, continuous, and often contradictory. You notice how a small cough or the rustle of skirts can feel monumental under such scrutiny. Every gesture carries weight. Every glance may betray inner thoughts. The tools may be strange: vinegar, rosewater, cats, letters. But the result is always the same. A girl's life is under evaluation, her virtue quantified by invisible rules she did not create. And you can almost hear a soft, ironic Victorian chuckle in the background. Good heavens, I hope she passes, as if passing purity is a game, yet the stakes could not be higher. The corridors, the hallways, and the quiet rooms of observation are filled with the tension of living proof, a constant, intimate trial that shapes every breath, every gesture, every dream. You move down a narrow, shadowed corridor where the polished wooden floorboards creak beneath your weight, and the air carries the faint scent of carbolic soap mingled with the sweet tang of beeswax polish. The corridor leads to a small sitting room where young women are taught poise, posture, and, indirectly, their suitability for society. This is the prelude to the more direct purity tests, a space where observation begins before any instrument or ritual comes into play. Here's a historical fact. Posture lessons were considered essential. A girl's carriage, the angle of her head, even the positioning of her fingers while holding a teacup were meticulously supervised. Social commentators of the era insisted that a properly held teacup conveyed virtue, while a careless grip hinted at moral laxity. Classes in deportment, charm, and speech were compulsory in many middle and upper-class households, effectively serving as a pretest before the more invasive examinations occurred. Quirk alert: some families maintained miniature mannequins, life-size dolls dressed in the latest fashions, to demonstrate how a proper young woman should walk, sit, or curtsy. Imagine a stiff little figure with a starched gown, perfectly posed, while young girls mimic it in silence, occasionally giggling as the doll's porcelain face seems to judge them. The Victorians certainly had flair for the theatrical. Historians still argue whether these lessons empowered women by giving them a polished, marketable presence, or whether they were purely a mechanism of control, enforcing an arbitrary standard of propriety. Some see it as an early form of social training, others as surveillance masquerading as education. In one corner, a matron scribbles notes on a small pad, while a young woman practices a curtsy. Her movements are precise, but the tiniest hesitation, a fleeting tremor in her wrist, or a hesitant dip of the head, is noted. You sense how the weight of expectation presses on her, how every glance from the chaperone sharpens the tension. And then there's a whimsical detail. In some households, girls were evaluated on their ability to maintain a smile without teeth showing, supposedly indicating modesty and reserve. You can almost see a girl struggling to hold a perfect, lips-pressed smile for minutes, her jaw aching, while the matron watches with approving or critical eyes. It's absurd, yet entirely real. Letters, gifts, and even casual conversations were monitored. A playful compliment from a suitor, a borrowed book, or a shared laugh could spark discussion and suspicion. Families often conducted private interviews, sometimes posing as innocuous questions about hobbies, reading, or music preferences, while carefully assessing moral character. And yes, cats and dogs sometimes appeared in these scenarios too. Some observers believed that a girl's interaction with animals revealed natural temperament, and by extension, virtue. Imagine a small dog nuzzling a young woman, and the matron leaning forward with pen poised. Note her reaction, gentle, hesitant, or overly affectionate. The animal remains blissfully indifferent to the moral calculus, a silent, furry participant in this elaborate theatre. Historians still debate the psychological effect of these routines. Did constant scrutiny cultivate refinement, or did it breed anxiety and self-doubt? Some girls reportedly developed ingenious strategies, tiny coded gestures or secret diaries to survive the invasive gaze of their observers. Others simply endured, stoic and silent, hoping to navigate the labyrinth without faltering. And so you sit in this imagined room, observing every meticulous bend of the wrist, every cautious glance, and every carefully placed step. The tests are subtle yet pervasive, theatrical yet threatening, and in their intricate web, young women learn quickly that in Victorian society the line between everyday behaviour and moral failing is astonishingly thin. You drift into a larger room now, where the air carries a faint mixture of candle wax and polished oak, and the sunlight spills lazily across an embroidered rug, highlighting the meticulous symmetry of the furniture. This is the space where observation intensifies, where the routines of daily life themselves become a form of testing. You notice how every gesture, every tilt of the head, even a hesitant sigh could be catalogued, analysed, and judged. A historical fact, some families employed mirrors strategically in bedrooms and sitting areas, angled so that a chaperone or matron could observe a girl's behaviour without entering the room. This method allowed continuous supervision while maintaining the pretense of privacy. You can almost see the reflections dancing on the polished glass, capturing every flicker of emotion, every nervous adjustment of a sleeve. And here's a quirky tidbit. Certain families kept a virtue clock, a small device that monitored when a young woman rose, ate, or retired to bed. The clock wasn't mechanical in the modern sense, rather it was an elaborate schedule maintained by matrons and governesses who recorded compliance with strict timetables. Being late to breakfast or lingering too long in the drawing room could earn subtle reprimands or at least whispers in the hall about one's diligence, or lack thereof. You can almost imagine a young lady glancing at a gilded timepiece, hoping she hasn't been late by a mere 2 minutes. Historians still argue whether these schedules were intended for health, productivity, or pure social control. Some scholars suggest that a structured day promoted mental discipline, while others insist it was an invasive system designed to suppress individuality and enforce conformity. A young girl sits by a window, fidgeting with her lace cuff, while a matron, perched elegantly on a chair nearby, notes her behavior in a small, leather-bound journal. Each nervous glance at the window, each hesitation to rise when summoned, is recorded meticulously. It's like being perpetually under a microscope, except the microscope is the human eye, and it's everywhere. You might smile at the absurdity. In some households, girls were evaluated based on how they poured tea. Not whether it was hot or cool, but the angle of the teapot, the steadiness of the wrist, and the grace of the pour. Too hasty, too deliberate, too clumsy, any deviation might be interpreted as a flaw of character. Imagine pouring a cup of Earl Grey and realizing your moral standing depends on that single gesture. Letters and personal effects were also scrutinized. Diaries, sketchbooks, and even small charms or trinkets were sometimes examined for improper content. A note from a friend, a small pressed flower, or a drawing of a fanciful bird could be misread as evidence of precocious sentimentality, or worse, impropriety. There's a whimsical side too. Some families believed that a girl's reaction to music could indicate virtue. Too much enthusiasm for a lively waltz might suggest passion, while a hesitant or overly restrained response signaled propriety. You can picture a chamber filled with soft piano notes, a young woman waltzing carefully under the watchful eyes of her observers, each step a silent moral test. Historians still debate how pervasive these tests were outside wealthy urban homes. Some argue they were confined to elite circles, while others suggest that echoes of these practices reached even modest households, passed down through local customs and parental guidance. And as you lean against the sun-warmed windowsill, you realize the peculiar, relentless logic of this world. Every action is evidence, every gesture testimony, and every day a trial of social virtue. In this delicate balance of observation, instruction, and subtle intimidation, young women were shaped into what Victorian society deemed fit for the world beyond their household walls. The hallway narrows again, and you feel the shift in atmosphere. The air grows heavier, tinged with lavender and something sharper, like antiseptic. You step into a small examination chamber where the decor is minimal, practical. A polished wooden table, a high-backed chair, and shelves lined with jars of powders, oils, and curious implements. Here, the ritual of the more direct purity tests begins, a place where observation is no longer passive, but tactically interactive. A historical fact, physicians in Victorian times sometimes conducted intimate examinations under the guise of verifying a young woman's sexual innocence. These assessments were rarely standardized, often reliant on subjective judgments of anatomy, skin tone, or responsiveness, guided by medical theories that would strike modern practitioners as dubious at best. Such visits were typically brief, yet their psychological weight lingered, as the mere anticipation of inspection could be punishing. Quirky detail, some families employed a peculiar taste test for virtue, though not in the literal sense you might imagine. Small, flavored poultices or scented tissues were placed on the skin, supposedly revealing moral character by how the scent interacted with the girl's natural chemistry. Imagine a teenager sniffing a rose-scented cotton ball, hoping the subtle reaction won't betray her inner life. You probably won't survive this mental image without feeling slightly queasy, and yet it happened. Historians still argue whether these practices were genuinely intended for medical observation or were performative exercises to assert parental authority and social norms. Some scholars suggest the examinations were more theatrical than diagnostic, a structured anxiety ritual more than a science. A young woman sits nervously on the edge of the high-backed chair, hands folded in her lap, eyes darting toward the door and then down at the patterned rug. The matron's pen scratches quietly in a notebook, noting each twitch of a finger, each hesitant intake of breath. It's impossible not to imagine the internal dialogue racing through the girl's mind. Do they suspect? Am I too tense? Am I myself? There's an almost absurd layer to the process. Some households believed that a girl's reaction to cold water splashed gently on the wrist could indicate emotional discipline. Too startled, and it signified weakness, too calm, and perhaps a hidden cunning. You picture the matron poised with a small silver cup, carefully pouring the water as the girl flinches ever so slightly, a microcosm of morality playing out in miniature. Letters, trinkets, and secret sketches remained fair game. A pressed flower, a fanciful doodle, or even a playful poem could be interpreted as revealing hidden passions. Young women often became adept at concealment, folding papers in clever ways, writing in cipher, or choosing carefully which objects to display. Each small act of concealment was a survival skill, a subtle rebellion against constant scrutiny. Even animals made cameo appearances. Cats, in particular, were unwitting participants in these tests. How a girl held, stroked, or responded to the feline's antics could be read as indicative of temperament, empathy, or restraint. The cat, of course, remained blissfully uninterested, padding silently across rugs and escaping the moral calculus entirely. Historians still debate the long-term psychological effects. Did the constant monitoring cultivate resilience, attention to nuance, and social skill? Or did it implant anxiety, hypervigilance, and self-doubt? Records hint at both outcomes. Some women later thrived under the discipline, while others recounted the examinations as formative traumas, the memory of which lingered into adulthood. And as you imagine the soft scratch of pen on paper, the faint scent of rosewater, and the subtle tension in the room, you sense how Victorian life could transform ordinary acts, walking, sitting, handling objects, into layered moral trials. Here, in the quiet of this chamber, virtue is measured not in deeds but in stillness, responsiveness, and controlled behavior, a meticulous choreography that leaves no movement unexamined. You find yourself in a narrow, dimly lit corridor lined with heavy drapes that filter sunlight into soft golden stripes. The air carries the mingling scents of lavender, beeswax, and faint chalk dust from the educational slate boards in the rooms you just passed. Here, routines begin to feel ritualistic. Young women shuffle quietly, posture perfect, hands folded or clasped lightly before them, every movement catalogued by a distant observer. This is the subtle theatre of the Victorian purity test, the stage upon which the day-to-day motions become evidence. Historical fact: beyond formal examinations, many Victorian households relied on indirect observation to gauge a girl's character. Chaperones noted even the smallest gestures, how a hand rested on a book, how a foot tapped under the table, or how long a girl lingered near the window. Social comportment was tantamount to morality. A seemingly idle glance or a misplaced smile could ripple through evaluations, sometimes influencing marriage prospects. A quirky tidbit: some families maintained mood diaries where they tracked minor changes in demeanor across weeks. Matrons would record whether a girl was unusually giggly after supper or unusually solemn before bedtime, theorizing that these fluctuations reflected inner virtue or inclination. You can almost picture a young girl glancing over a shoulder, suspicious of the ink-stained notebook in which her every minor quirk is logged. It's absurd, slightly theatrical, yet undeniably real. Historians still argue whether these indirect observations were genuinely intended to cultivate discipline or were primarily a method of control. Some suggest that meticulous record-keeping encouraged attentiveness and etiquette. Others claim it imposed unnecessary stress and fostered self-consciousness that lingered into adulthood. Here, subtlety reigns. You watch a girl as she pours tea, the cup trembling slightly in her hands, careful to avoid spilling a drop. Across the room, the matron's gaze flickers, a slight nod for correct form, a pen poised for annotation. The ritual seems mundane, almost meditative, yet beneath its calm surface lies a quiet pressure. Every minor misstep, a dropped napkin, a faltering bow, becomes evidence, a whisper of impropriety waiting to be documented. And then a whimsical note. In some households, a girl's preference for certain flowers, or even her ability to identify them correctly in the garden, was taken as an indication of purity and refinement. Imagine kneeling in a rosebed, hands trembling slightly as you point to a blossom, aware that your knowledge, or ignorance, could subtly influence your social standing. Animals continued to play curious roles. Small dogs or canaries might be used to observe natural temperament. Did she coax the animal gently, or was she impatient? The creatures offered an unintentional litmus test for empathy and patience, qualities highly prized in the Victorian moral framework. Historians still debate whether the psychological burden of these subtle tests had lasting effects. Some women internalized the scrutiny, crafting careful, deliberate versions of themselves that persisted into social life, while others recalled feelings of suffocation and perpetual anxiety. Either way, the rhythm of daily life, walking, speaking, gesturing, interacting with objects or creatures, was transformed into a continuous moral evaluation, a performance that never truly ended. And as you follow this quiet procession, the soft light brushing patterned carpets, the delicate fragrance of the room lingering in your senses, you begin to appreciate the intricate, almost theatrical layers of control and observation that defined the Victorian approach to virtue. Even the most mundane actions were charged with significance, a constant dance between appearance, expectation, and silent judgment. You step into a softly sunlit study where the air smells faintly of ink and polished mahogany. Shelves lined with leather-bound books create a quiet hum of scholarship, and a delicate dust motes dance lazily in the shafts of light. Here, the purity tests take a slightly different form, less physical, more psychological. Conversation itself becomes a measurement, and the way a young woman navigates words, pauses, and inflections can signal virtue or lack thereof. Historical fact: in many Victorian households, young women underwent conversational assessments with tutors or matrons. They were encouraged, or sometimes coerced, to discuss literature, art, or current events. Their responses, facial expressions, and even minor hesitations were noted. The belief was that a girl's ability to reason calmly and express herself gracefully reflected her moral character. Quirky tidbit: some families introduced scenario questions, hypothetical situations, designed to gauge ethical judgment. For example, a matron might ask, "If you found a lost brooch in the garden, what would you do?" The answer was less about honesty than about demonstrating temperance, modesty, and adherence to social etiquette. Some girls practiced entire answers in their journals, plotting the perfect combination of virtue and cleverness to survive the subtle scrutiny. Historians still argue whether these conversational tests genuinely assessed character or merely reinforced social conformity. Some scholars suggest that the exercises cultivated eloquence and confidence, while others contend they imposed restrictive norms, emphasizing obedience over individuality. You notice a young woman sitting stiffly at a small desk, carefully forming letters in a diary, while a matron observes from an armchair. The pen scratches in long, precise strokes, a delicate ballet of ink and intention. Every phrase is weighed, every sentiment filtered, as if the diary itself could betray hidden inclinations. It's both amusing and unsettling, a private reflection subjected to public judgment, where even one stray flourish might be interpreted as a sign of immorality. And here's a slightly whimsical Victorian touch. Some families employed coded language in letters, requiring girls to use approved metaphors or floral references to convey emotions. A red rose might symbolize modest affection, a violet restraint, while a tulip could be interpreted as youthful exuberance. The matron's role was to decode the messages, making sense of feelings expressed in the delicate language of flowers. You can almost see a girl carefully choosing her words or petals to survive the moral test without raising suspicion. Animals, still unbothered by human theatrics, occasionally wandered into these examinations. A cat might curl around a girl's ankle as she writes, prompting a subtle note. Comfortable, gentle, or overly affectionate? These tiny interactions became yet another lens through which virtue was assessed, often with comical consequences if the animal refused to cooperate. Historians still debate the long-term consequences of these observation-driven assessments. Did they nurture social intelligence and careful reasoning, or did they seed a lifetime of self-consciousness and caution? Anecdotal evidence suggests both outcomes existed side by side, shaping a generation of women who moved through society with a careful awareness of how every gesture, glance, and word could be scrutinized. As you linger in this study, the faint scent of ink and polished wood curling in the warm sunlight, you realize that Victorian purity tests extended far beyond physical examinations. Conversation, reflection, and even the subtle interaction with one's environment became arenas for moral evaluation, a relentless, sometimes absurd, but meticulously structured theatre of virtue. Here, every syllable, every pause, every gesture mattered, quietly shaping the young women who passed through these rooms. You drift down a narrow spiral staircase, the polished oak steps creaking softly underfoot, the air cooler now, carrying the faint scent of damp stone and beeswax from the torches lining the walls. This level of the house is quieter, almost hushed, where shadows stretch long and the cadence of footsteps becomes a subtle rhythm in the otherwise still atmosphere. Here, the purity tests shift again, moving into the realm of physical composure and controlled activity, a delicate ballet of poise and measured behavior. Historical fact: Victorian etiquette manuals often prescribed strict rules for posture, gait, and hand placement, believing that physical comportment reflected inner morality. Girls were trained to walk slowly, to avoid abrupt movements, to keep hands folded when seated, and even to tilt their head just so while speaking. Every step was a tiny moral performance. A quirky tidbit: in some households, mirrors were strategically placed to allow matron observers to monitor posture during simple activities like dusting or arranging flowers. The reflections acted as invisible witnesses, ensuring that grace was maintained even in mundane chores. You can almost see the faint reflection of a carefully arched back, the precise lift of a wrist, and the quiet, almost theatrical perfection of ordinary movements. Historians still argue whether these practices were genuinely intended to instill elegance, or whether they served as a subtle form of social control. Some suggest that the repetition and discipline fostered refinement and attentiveness. Others maintain it imposed psychological stress, teaching girls to internalize scrutiny at every moment. A young woman carries a silver tray up the staircase, balancing it carefully while avoiding a single misstep. Every subtle wobble is a potential mark against her, though the observer's gaze remains poised, unreadable. The act of walking, so simple in ordinary life, becomes a test of moral character, a performance where even minor deviations might signal irresponsibility or carelessness. And here's an almost whimsical note: some households incorporated breath tests into physical exercises. Girls were instructed to take calm, measured breaths while walking or performing chores, under the belief that a steady inhalation and exhalation indicated self-control and inner virtue. Imagine someone carefully modulating each breath while carrying a teapot or dusting a shelf. It sounds like something out of a Victorian yoga manual, slightly absurd yet historically documented. Animals continued to have a silent role. A cat perched on a windowsill could observe a girl's balance and composure as she moved through the room. Did she acknowledge the creature's presence with grace, or did she flinch, revealing impatience or nervousness? Even these subtle interactions could be noted in the household log as small indicators of temperament and propriety. Historians still debate the broader societal effects of these exercises. Did they cultivate elegance, awareness, and discipline, or did they produce anxiety-ridden adults hyper-aware of the gaze of others? Evidence points to both, a paradoxical outcome of a system designed to shape, observe, and occasionally amuse those who administered it. As you watch the interplay of shadows, candlelight, and careful movement, the world of Victorian purity tests unfolds as a complex choreography where every action, walking, breathing, interacting with objects or animals, is loaded with moral significance. Even the simplest gestures are woven into a tapestry of observation and expectation, quietly molding character in ways both subtle and pervasive. You wander into a bright, airy drawing room where sunlight spills across patterned rugs and gilded picture frames. The walls are adorned with landscapes and delicate portraits, but your attention is drawn to the faint whisper of activity. A young woman arranges teacups with measured care, while another traces her fingers over the embroidery on a cushion. Here, the purity tests become a study in domestic finesse and attention to detail, a meticulous measurement of composure under mundane yet morally loaded circumstances. Historical fact: Victorian households often emphasized domestic aptitude as a marker of virtue. Girls were trained to manage small tasks, pouring tea, arranging flowers, folding linens, not only as practical skills but as demonstrations of diligence, patience, and moral reliability. Their performance in these activities was sometimes logged in household diaries, much like a modern performance review, albeit with a moralistic undertone. Quirky tidbit: some families employed a teacup alignment test, measuring a girl's ability to arrange cups symmetrically on a tray, supposedly reflecting balance, grace, and character. If one cup was slightly askew, it could be interpreted as a sign of carelessness, or worse, lack of virtue. You probably won't survive picturing a 16-year-old measuring a teacup's tilt with her little finger while her matron observes silently from across the room. Historians still argue whether these domestic evaluations were genuinely intended to teach skills or were primarily a method of social control. Some contend that they fostered attentiveness and coordination, while others maintain they placed unnecessary stress on young women, reinforcing anxiety about constant observation. A girl bends over a basket of sewing materials, sorting threads by color, while the matron notes the speed, neatness, and posture of each movement. There's an almost comical tension in the air, as if the entire household's moral fabric depends on the alignment of silk threads and the tilt of a teacup. The young women perform with quiet seriousness, aware that each subtle misstep, spilled sugar, a crooked napkin, a slightly uneven stitch, could subtly shift perceptions of their character. And an odd Victorian flourish: in some households, girls were asked to read poetry aloud while simultaneously performing domestic tasks, a dual exercise in poise and multitasking that tested composure, diction, and grace under pressure. Imagine reciting lines from Byron while folding napkins, trying not to trip over the corner of a rug, all under a critical gaze. Slightly absurd but historically practiced, animals remained unbothered participants. A curious cat might weave between the legs of a girl arranging teacups, offering unintentional tests in patience and composure. Did she maintain focus, gently guiding the cat away, or did she startle, revealing impatience or frustration? Even the smallest creature became an unwitting judge of virtue. Historians still debate whether these domestic rituals had lasting positive or negative effects. Some women reported mastery, confidence, and social grace cultivated through meticulous practice, while others remembered anxiety, hyper-awareness, and a sense of perpetual evaluation that followed them into adulthood. As you take in the gentle hum of quiet footsteps, the faint rustle of fabric, and the light-catching gold in picture frames, you sense how Victorian virtue was woven into the ordinary, into every gesture, glance, and careful arrangement of household objects. Here, morality is inseparable from movement, grace, and attentiveness, a continuous, sometimes absurd, theatre of propriety. You enter a softly perfumed bedroom where sunlight filters through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns across the polished floorboards. The room smells faintly of lavender sachets and beeswax polish, a scent designed to soothe but also to remind you of order. Here, the tests focus on personal grooming and appearance, a meticulous attention to dress, cleanliness, and the subtle cues of propriety. Every movement, every brushstroke of hair becomes a moral and social performance. Historical fact: Victorian society placed immense emphasis on outward appearance as a reflection of inner virtue. Young women were instructed to maintain immaculate hair, carefully chosen attire, and subtle, appropriate gestures, with the belief that personal care mirrored moral integrity. Combs, pins, and carefully arranged ribbons were not merely decorative, they were tools in a silent examination of character. Quirky tidbit: in some households, girls underwent corset observation, where a matron might watch how a young woman laced her bodice, noting patience, technique, and even facial expression. The act of tightening a corset, painful and constraining, was interpreted as a lesson in self-control and discipline. You can imagine trying not to grimace while someone watches every tug and twist, a strange blend of agony and performance art. Historians still argue whether these grooming rituals were intended to cultivate elegance or were primarily tools of social and psychological control. Some suggest they instilled attention to detail and discipline, while others argue they imposed unnecessary physical and mental strain. A young woman brushes her long hair methodically, each stroke deliberate, almost meditative, while the matron observes from a corner, pen poised. Even the choice of ribbon color, the neatness of the plaits, and the gentle sway of the hair were noted. It is a world where perfection is expected in miniature details, and any slight deviation can ripple into social consequences. And a slightly whimsical note, in some households, scented gloves were used to test olfactory awareness and decorum. A young woman might be asked to select gloves with subtle differences in scent, a playful yet peculiar measure of attentiveness, patience, and sensory refinement. You can almost see the delicate sniffing of lace gloves, trying not to appear overzealous while demonstrating discernment. Animals, often unbothered by human concerns, played their quiet roles. A small bird in a cage might signal emotional composure. Did the girl startle at a sudden flutter or maintain calm, showing steadiness? Even these tiny moments became part of the subtle web of assessment. Historians still debate the long-term consequences of these appearance-focused tests. Some women emerged with refined grace and meticulous habits that served them well socially, while others reported anxiety, hyper-awareness, and feelings of inadequacy cultivated by constant scrutiny. As you watch the soft glint of sunlight on polished combs, the gentle sway of braided hair, and the measured rhythm of brushing, you sense how Victorian purity tests extended into the private sphere. Virtue was expressed not only in actions but in posture, grooming, and even sensory awareness, a continuous, quietly performed assessment of character and composure. You wander into a narrow hallway lined with portraits whose eyes seem to follow your every move, a faint draught carrying the scent of polished wood and candle smoke. Here, the purity tests take on a social dimension, subtly assessing interactions with peers, visitors, and household staff. Every word you utter, every slight nod or bow, becomes an examination of manners, restraint, and moral awareness. Historical fact: Victorian girls were often evaluated in social settings, attending afternoon teas, musical recitals, or small gatherings where their conduct, choice of conversation, and attentiveness were observed. Mothers or matrons kept mental notes, or even actual diaries, tracking politeness, modesty, and appropriate engagement with different social ranks. Quirky tidbit: some households implemented the doorway test, a subtle method where a girl entering or exiting a room was watched for how gracefully she navigated thresholds. Crossing the room too quickly, hesitating excessively, or gesturing awkwardly could result in whispered notes about carelessness or impropriety. You can picture a young woman measuring each step like a secret ballet performance, trying not to trip over the invisible expectations hovering in the air. Historians still argue whether these social observations genuinely promoted etiquette and refinement, or if they were a mechanism to instill lifelong self-consciousness and fear of judgment. Some scholars suggest the exercises built confidence in social navigation, while others contend they created anxiety about constant surveillance. A young woman converses with a visiting cousin, carefully modulating her tone, smiling without excess, nodding at intervals that convey attentiveness without seeming eager. The subtle art of listening becomes a moral barometer, and even laughter is measured, never too loud, never too faint. There's a delicate tension between authenticity and performativity, and the observer notes it all with almost imperceptible pen movements. And a slightly playful Victorian quirk. Some families assigned conversation badges, small slips of paper that recorded notable social behaviors, like complimenting the hostess without flattery, or responding to a question with wit and modesty. These badges were later discussed in private, often humorously, turning social interaction into a game of subtle moral chess. You can imagine a girl inwardly celebrating a small victory, her compliment perfectly balanced, her smile measured, and the matron silently nodding in approval. Animals continued their silent roles, A dog lounging nearby might test composure, whether a girl reacted with abruptness or maintained gentle calm, revealing patience and kindness. Even minor interactions were scrutinized and folded into the wider evaluation of character. Historians still debate the long-term psychological effects of these social assessments. Did they instill grace, tact, and careful observation, or did they foster anxiety, overcaution, and a lifelong preoccupation with others' opinions? Evidence suggests both occurred, shaping a generation in subtle and enduring ways. As you watch the interplay of gestures, the cadence of conversation, and the delicate social choreography of the room, you realize that Victorian purity tests extended beyond private rooms into social spheres. Virtue was measured not only by action but by interaction, a quiet theatre, where the smallest smile or tilt of the head carried moral weight. You step into a dimly lit music room, the scent of polished wood mingling with faint traces of wax polish and old paper. A grand piano stands near the window, its ivory keys gleaming softly in the muted sunlight, while sheet music is scattered across the stand, notes curling like delicate vines. Here, the purity tests intertwine with artistic ability, assessing not only skill but poise, emotional control, and social grace under the guise of music and performance. Historical fact: Victorian girls were often required to learn instruments such as the piano, harp, or violin. Musical proficiency was not merely a leisure pursuit, it was considered an essential marker of moral cultivation, refinement, and suitability for marriage. Mastery of music symbolized discipline, patience, and emotional balance. Quirky tidbit: in some households, students underwent performance endurance tests, where they played through an entire piece while simultaneously responding to subtle distractions, a coughing guest, a creaking floorboard, or an unexpected glare from a matron. The ability to maintain composure while fingers danced across the keys was seen as a direct reflection of character. Imagine trying not to twitch a toe while accidentally hitting a sour note, knowing that invisible eyes are recording your every movement. Historians still argue whether these musical tests were primarily intended to cultivate artistry or to enforce conformity and control. Some suggest that they produced genuinely skilled musicians and graceful performers. Others maintain that the constant pressure fostered anxiety and fear of public failure. A young woman sits at the piano, her posture perfect, fingers poised with deliberate elegance. She begins to play a simple sonata, each note measured and precise, while the matron observes silently from the back of the room. The young woman's breathing is steady, her gaze calm, her expression serene, yet every glance, every subtle adjustment of her shoulders or hands is scrutinized. The test is not only musical but psychological, a meditation on composure and control. And here's an almost whimsical fact: some households combine music with emotional response monitoring, asking girls to convey the mood of a piece through subtle facial expressions or posture while maintaining overall propriety. You can picture a soft smile, a slight tilt of the head, a quiet arch of the eyebrows, tiny gestures laden with moral significance. Animals were predictably present as impartial critics. A canary in a gilded cage might chirp nervously in response to a wrong note, signaling composure under pressure, or lack thereof. The girl's reaction, whether startled or calm, became part of the subtle moral calculus. Historians still debate the broader implications of these musical exercises. Did they foster creativity and emotional intelligence, or did they impose perfectionism and anxiety under the guise of cultivation? Evidence points to a mixture of both, leaving young women simultaneously talented, disciplined, and acutely self-conscious. As you watch the sunlight reflect off the piano keys and the gentle sway of hair as hands move gracefully across the instrument, you realize that in Victorian society, music was never merely music. It was an exercise in virtue, observation, and silent, relentless performance. Even a single wrong note carried moral weight. You move into the library, a hushed cathedral of polished mahogany shelves and dusty tomes whose spines gleam gold in the soft afternoon light. The scent of aged paper and ink mingles with the faint aroma of beeswax polish, grounding you in a sense of quiet reverence. Here, the purity tests rely on intellect, memory, and moral discernment, a subtle evaluation of thought and judgment as girls peruse, recite, or debate the lessons of classical literature and religious texts. Historical fact: Victorian education for girls often included rigorous reading of moral tales, scripture, poetry, and classical works. Mastery of these texts, along with the ability to discuss them intelligently, was considered a sign of moral and intellectual virtue. Recitation and comprehension tests were common in private households and boarding schools, blending literacy with ethical formation. Quirky tidbit: some families practiced moral interrogation exercises, where a girl would read a passage aloud and then answer questions about not only the plot, but also the implied virtues or ethical choices of the characters. One young girl might be asked why a character's generosity mattered, while another might be challenged to identify subtle faults in behavior, all under the watchful gaze of an approving or disapproving matron. You can imagine a teen sweating over whether she interpreted Hamlet's ethics correctly, while the cat perched on the windowsill judges her silently. Historians still argue whether these literary exercises cultivated genuine critical thinking or were a method of enforcing pre-approved moral interpretations. Some suggest that they encouraged careful reading, empathy, and ethical reflection, while others maintain they instilled fear of misjudgment and stifled independent thought. A girl stands before the fireplace, reciting lines from a poem, her voice calm but measured, the flickering light throwing delicate shadows across her face. The matron nods at intervals, taking mental notes of cadence, clarity, and comprehension. Every inflection, pause, and emphasis becomes a silent measure of diligence, intelligence, and moral awareness. And an amusing Victorian twist: some households introduced a book-sniffing test, asking girls to identify different volumes by smell alone, parchment, ink, leather bindings, supposedly to cultivate attentiveness, sensory refinement, and an appreciation for the subtle distinctions of knowledge. You might picture a young woman leaning over a stack of dusty tomes, trying to inhale sophistication without sneezing. Even the smallest details counted. A misplaced bookmark, a smudged finger, or the wrong handling of a folio could signal inattentiveness or lack of respect. Animals, like a sleepy terrier sprawled on a rug, again became silent evaluators of composure. Did she startle at a yawn or maintain grace under a minor disturbance? Historians still debate the broader impact of these intellectual purity tests. Some women emerged as thoughtful, well-read, and socially competent. Others internalized anxiety, self-criticism, and a sense that even private thought could be scrutinized. As you watch the flicker of firelight on the gilt edges of books, the careful unfolding of pages, and the quiet concentration on a young woman's face, you realize that virtue in Victorian society was inseparable from intellect, attention to detail, and composure. Reading was never passive. It was a moral exercise, a performance of mind as much as of manners. You follow the faint creak of floorboards into a sun-dappled sewing room, where the gentle hum of a spinning wheel accompanies the rhythmic tap of needles on fabric. The air smells of cotton, wool, and faintly sweet starch, as if the room itself exhales discipline and patience. Here, the purity tests take the form of practical labor, examining dexterity, attention to detail, and, perhaps most insidiously, obedience to strict domestic standards. Historical fact: Victorian girls were often trained extensively in needlework, embroidery, and other domestic crafts. Skillful execution of these tasks was not simply about homemaking, it symbolized diligence, precision, and moral rectitude. A perfectly hemmed seam or intricately stitched pattern was as much a reflection of virtue as any verbal recitation or measured smile. Quirky tidbit: some households implemented pattern endurance tests, where a young woman was asked to reproduce the same complex motif repeatedly over hours, all while maintaining absolute composure. Mistakes were often corrected silently, with the matron observing for subtle signs of frustration or sloppiness. You can imagine trying not to twitch your hand while stitching a tiny rose, knowing that your moral character, apparently, is entwined with the tension of thread. Historians still argue whether such repetitive domestic training cultivated skill and patience, or simply enforced a culture of meticulous self-surveillance and perfectionism. Some accounts suggest these tasks fostered pride and practical competence, while others highlight the psychological strain of constant evaluation. A young woman threads a needle with trembling fingers, then leans over the fabric, tracing tiny, perfect stitches along a hem. The matron circles silently, eyes flicking from needlepoint to posture, making mental notes of calmness, precision, and consistency. Even the subtle tilt of the head or the rhythm of breathing is considered significant, a sign of steadiness or lack thereof. And an almost whimsical note, some families practiced invisible stitching games, challenging girls to sew without leaving any visible knots or errors, as if competing against a ghostly perfection. You can imagine the quiet triumph when a row of flawless stitches emerges, rewarded not by applause but by a brief nod of approval, a silent seal of moral and technical accomplishment. Animals, again, participate silently. A cat perched on the windowsill watches the delicate movements unbothered by human anxieties, but the girl's reactions to its sudden stretch or yawn are noted. Calm and steady responses signify composure. Flinches, impatience, or frustration subtly count against her. Historians still debate whether these practical domestic exercises prepared women for independence and skillful management, or merely reinforced rigid societal expectations, embedding the belief that moral worth was inseparable from perfection in trivial tasks. As you observe the meticulous movements, the soft glint of needles catching the light, and the patient folding of fabric, it becomes clear that Victorian virtue extended into every stitch, every measured movement, every quiet hour of labour. Skill, composure, and moral conduct were woven together as inseparably as thread in a delicate tapestry. You wander down a corridor lined with mirrors, their polished surfaces reflecting dim sunlight and casting faint, elongated shadows across the patterned carpet. In this space, the purity tests focus on appearance, posture, and the management of one's own reflection, a daily rehearsal of self-presentation and controlled demeanour. Every movement is under subtle scrutiny, the angle of a shoulder, the grace of a hand, the steadiness of a gaze. Historical fact, Victorian girls were taught extensive courses in deportment, including walking, sitting, and gesturing with precise elegance. These lessons, often conducted in mirrored rooms or under the supervision of a governess, were considered essential indicators of moral virtue and social readiness. Graceful movements were interpreted as a reflection of internal discipline and self-control. Quirky tidbit: some families employed mirror endurance exercises, where a girl would stand for extended periods, practicing smiles, poses, and gestures while counting breaths to maintain calm composure. Rumour has it that in certain households girls even practiced curtsies in front of pets, who served as impartial judges of steadiness. Imagine a cat lounging indifferently while you attempt the perfect bend of the knee. Historians still argue whether these exercises genuinely cultivated poise or simply ingrained obsessive self-monitoring. Some accounts suggest they instilled confidence and awareness of social nuance, while others indicate they heightened anxiety about external judgment and constant evaluation. A young woman steps gracefully across the room, each footfall deliberate, her hands lightly brushing the folds of her dress. She adjusts her posture with a subtle, almost imperceptible shift, noting the slight tilt in the mirror and correcting it without hesitation. The governess observes silently, a faint smile suggesting approval, or perhaps mild amusement at the meticulous choreography. An amusing Victorian anecdote: some girls were taught to practice conversations while performing these gestures, speaking polite phrases or reciting short moral aphorisms. This multitasking was supposed to build mental agility alongside physical elegance. You might imagine a girl curtsying and saying, "Good morning, esteemed visitor," while internally calculating whether her left foot landed with perfect alignment. Animals again participate quietly. A well-trained dog might follow her movements, subtly nudging or sniffing, providing an unexpected test of focus. A startled reaction could mark a lapse in composure, A calm response demonstrated steady nerves and moral fortitude. Historians still debate the psychological impact of these exercises. Were they empowering, giving girls a sense of control over their presentation and environment, or did they foster excessive self-consciousness and lifelong preoccupation with others' perceptions? Evidence suggests a complex blend, skills and confidence intertwined with caution and internalized scrutiny. As you trace her reflection in the mirrors, the light dancing across polished floors, and the measured rhythm of steps, you realize that in Victorian society, virtue was a visible performative art. Grace, discipline, and moral awareness were as much about how one moved as what one thought, and even the simplest gesture could carry profound social meaning. You drift into the airy conservatory, where sunlight spills across a mosaic of potted ferns, orchids, and climbing vines. The faint scent of damp earth mingles with the subtle perfume of blossoms, creating a serene, almost hypnotic atmosphere. Here, the purity tests intertwine with horticulture, as girls are assessed on patience, attentiveness, and the quiet care of living things. A delicate moral exercise disguised as gardening. Historical fact: Victorian girls were often instructed in botany and horticulture, learning to cultivate flowers, maintain greenhouses, and understand the subtle needs of various plants. Skill in gardening was seen as a reflection of moral character, patience, and a gentle, nurturing disposition. The proper tending of plants demonstrated diligence, attention to detail, and emotional steadiness. Quirky tidbit: some households conducted growth endurance experiments, where young women were tasked with nurturing a plant from seed to bloom over several weeks, while keeping meticulous journals of sunlight, watering, and temperature. A single wilted leaf could prompt questions about attentiveness, or so the law suggests. You can imagine the intense anxiety of staring at a stubborn cactus, willing it to flourish under the weight of silent judgment. Historians still argue whether these botanical exercises truly encouraged care and observation, or merely reinforced the internalization of judgment and perfectionism. Some suggest girls developed genuine horticultural skills and a love for nature, while others contend the constant scrutiny cultivated fear and self-consciousness. A girl kneels among pots of tiny primroses, gently adjusting soil and leaves, her fingers smudged with damp earth. Each movement is measured, calm, deliberate. The matron glances over her shoulder, noting posture, patience, and the steadiness of hand. Even the soft hum of the conservatory bees is considered a subtle backdrop to the moral evaluation. Did the girl remain undisturbed, or did she flinch at the smallest buzz? And here's an almost whimsical detail. Some families incorporated scent discernment tests, asking girls to identify flowers blindfolded, relying on their sense of smell alone. The exercise was thought to cultivate mindfulness and attention to subtleties in the environment, though one can imagine a few embarrassing sneezes and polite coughs in the process. Animals continued to serve as silent evaluators. A canary perched nearby might flutter nervously or remain calm, providing an unspoken gauge of the girl's composure. Calmness in the presence of nature and its unpredictable elements was praised, while any sign of impatience or frustration could be mentally noted. Historians still debate whether these horticultural purity tests instilled genuine patience and a connection to the natural world, or merely reinforced Victorian ideals of controlled femininity. The duality is clear. Girls learn to nurture and observe, but always under the invisible, sometimes oppressive, gaze of authority. As you watch her brush soil from her hands and trace patterns of light across the leaves, you realize that Victorian virtue, in this room, was entwined with life itself. Every leaf, every blossom, every quiet moment of care became a measure not just of skill, but of character, composure, and moral attention. In tending plants, girls tended themselves, learning that the smallest acts could reveal the truest virtues. You step into the music room, where sunlight spills over polished pianos and gleaming harps, catching dust motes that float lazily in the warm air. The faint, lingering scent of varnish and sheet music mingles with the soft echo of distant birdsong outside. Here, purity is tested through harmony and discipline, as girls are evaluated on musical skill, emotional restraint, and the ability to perform under the watchful gaze of a teacher or visiting family member. Historical fact: Victorian girls were often required to study music extensively, especially piano or harp, as part of their education. Mastery of an instrument was not simply an aesthetic accomplishment, but a moral indicator. Discipline, patience, and refinement were considered inseparable from musical skill. Public performance, even within the household, was seen as a measure of poise, diligence, and social readiness. Quirky tidbit: some households held silent accompaniment tests, where a girl would play while keeping strict composure, often with a small audience of pets, family, and staff. Even a misplayed note was not simply a mistake, it was a potential sign of moral or emotional weakness. Imagine a young pianist's hand trembling ever so slightly while a curious parrot tilts its head, as if judging her performance more thoroughly than any governess could. Historians still argue whether these musical exercises truly developed character, or whether they enforced an unhealthy fixation on perfection and constant scrutiny. Some women emerge with extraordinary skill and confidence, while others develop chronic anxiety around public performance. A girl's fingers glide over the ivory keys, producing delicate arpeggios that ripple through the room like a quiet stream. She maintains a serene expression, though inside a storm of concentration rages. The teacher observes silently, jotting notes on posture, timing, and subtle facial expressions. Even the soft inhalation before a difficult passage is scrutinized, each breath a measure of self-control. And an almost playful detail: some families encouraged improvisation trials, asking girls to extemporize short pieces while keeping hands and posture perfectly poised. The idea was to test both creativity and composure, though it often resulted in giggles, stifled coughs, and the occasional squeaky note, reminding everyone, perhaps, that even the strictest training could not fully suppress personality. Animals, too, remained subtle evaluators. A cat, stretched on a windowsill, or a canary's fluttering wings, could provoke the slightest flinch or distraction. Those who remained calm were considered steady, disciplined, and morally sound. Those who wavered risked quiet reproach. Historians still debate whether these musical purity tests fostered genuine artistic appreciation or were merely a reflection of societal obsession with control, performance, and conformity. In either case, the room hums with a combination of discipline, beauty, and silent tension. As you watch the notes ripple through the sunlit room, the gentle rise and fall of her chest with each chord, and the serene concentration etched across her face, it becomes clear that music was more than a skill in Victorian society. It was a test of composure, moral fortitude, and refined character. Performance in every sense, extending far beyond the ivory keys. You wander into the library where the scent of old parchment, ink, and polished wood envelops you like a warm, comforting cloak. Sunlight filters through tall windows, falling upon shelves stacked with leather-bound volumes whose gold-leafed spines glint softly. Here, the purity tests take a decidedly intellectual turn. Girls are measured by literacy, comprehension, and the elegance of thought expressed in written form. Historical fact: Victorian education emphasized reading and writing as markers of both intellect and morality. Girls were taught to compose essays, letters, and poetry, with style, grammar, and punctuation considered reflections of inner virtue. The ability to articulate oneself clearly and correctly was seen as an indicator of refinement, education, and social readiness. Quirky tidbit: in some households, girls were asked to copy passages from classic literature by candlelight for hours at a time, and any slight smudge or misaligned letter could be interpreted as inattentiveness or lack of moral focus. One can imagine a young hand cramping under the weight of perfection, while outside the family cat batted lazily at a discarded ribbon, unconcerned by human expectations. Historians still argue whether these literary exercises genuinely fostered critical thinking or merely reinforced obsessive attention to superficial correctness. Some argue that girls developed strong literacy skills, while others contend that constant correction and judgment imposed stress and perfectionist tendencies. A young woman sits at a mahogany desk, quill poised over parchment, eyes focused and steady. Each word she writes is deliberate, each line measured. Her governess watches silently from behind, noting posture, rhythm, and the faint tremor that might betray impatience or frustration. Even the angle of the wrist or the pressure applied to the quill is, somehow, a measure of character. A slightly humorous note. In some families, girls were encouraged to write letters to imaginary correspondents as exercises in empathy and rhetorical skill. These fictional exchanges often led to surprisingly intricate plots, misunderstandings, and witty asides, a rare outlet for personality under strict supervision. Imagine a 14-year-old crafting a passionate imaginary argument with a non-existent friend, all while maintaining perfect handwriting. Animals, as ever, act as quiet co-witnesses. A small dog napping beneath the desk or a bird tapping at the window might provoke a flicker of distraction. Composure in these moments signified steadiness and moral attentiveness, while any sign of irritation or hasty movement was mentally noted. Historians still debate the broader purpose of these intellectual purity tests. Were they intended to cultivate disciplined minds and refined expression, or were they simply another layer of societal control over young women, intertwining intelligence with obedience and performance? The quiet tension in the library seems to suggest both. As you watch her quill glide across the page, the faint scratch of ink harmonizing with the distant rustle of turning leaves outside, it becomes clear that writing was not just an academic exercise. It was a mirror for the soul, a measure of patience, and an artful dance between intellect, discipline, and moral fortitude, where every letter and line silently whispered the values of an entire society. You follow a narrow hallway into the art room where the smell of turpentine, chalk, and damp canvas mixes with the faint musk of drying plaster. Light spills unevenly through high windows, illuminating sketches pinned along the walls, each depicting landscapes, still lifes, or carefully rendered portraits. Here, the purity tests take a visual and tactile form. Girls are judged on creativity, precision, and the ability to capture beauty with their hands, translating observation into art. Historical fact, Victorian young women were often trained in drawing, watercolor, and decorative arts as part of a well-rounded education. Artistic skill was seen as an outward manifestation of refinement, taste, and discipline, and families prized it as a social marker for potential marriage prospects. A steady hand and an eye for detail were believed to reflect patience and moral sensibility. Quirky tidbit, in some households girls were asked to sketch a moral tableau based on an invented story, combining narrative understanding with artistic skill. The resulting images might show allegorical scenes of virtue and vice, often including dramatic flourishes like angels dangling ribbons or mischievous imps hiding in corners. Imagine a young girl painstakingly drawing an imp's smirk while suppressing giggles, fully aware that her governess could enter at any moment. Historians still argue whether these artistic exercises cultivated genuine creativity or merely reinforced societal expectations and conformity. Some women went on to produce impressive work, while others may have experienced anxiety and self-doubt under the weight of constant evaluation. A girl bends over her easel, brush poised above a palette of muted watercolors. Each stroke is deliberate, measured, and precise. The teacher moves silently behind her, noting not only the accuracy of color and proportion, but also her posture, breathing, and the calm steadiness of her gaze. Even the gentle shake of a hand could be seen as a lapse in focus, or in Victorian logic, a hint of moral faltering. And for a touch of levity, some families encouraged blind sketching challenges where girls would draw from memory or without looking at the page for brief moments. The results were predictably chaotic at times, cats with extra legs, flowers with unlikely geometry, but these exercises were supposed to strengthen observation, memory, and creative flexibility. Animals often continued their quiet oversight. A canary chirping in the corner or a sleeping dog beneath a stool became unexpected judges of composure. Startling them or reacting too sharply was frowned upon, for grace and calm under distraction was seen as a reflection of inner discipline. Historians still debate whether these artistic purity tests served a practical educational purpose or existed mainly to enforce the socialized ideals of femininity and decorum. What is certain is that the room hums with tension and concentration, creativity bound tightly by expectation. As you watch her brush sweep across the canvas, leaving delicate colors that blend like whispers of light and shadow, you recognize that art was both an expression and a test. It measured skill, patience, and moral attentiveness, turning every careful line, hue, and curve into an unspoken evaluation of character, as much as it was a reflection of talent. You wander into the embroidery room, where the soft glow of late afternoon sunlight pools over baskets of threads in every imaginable color, shimmering slightly against polished wooden tables. The faint scent of cotton, linen, and a whisper of mothballs lingers in the air. Here, precision and patience are paramount. Each stitch becomes a measure not only of skill but of temperament and moral steadiness, as girls are instructed to transform simple fabrics into intricate tapestries. Historical fact: needlework was a cornerstone of Victorian female education. Young women were taught embroidery, cross-stitch, and lace-making to cultivate patience, dexterity, and aesthetic sense. Mastery of these skills was considered evidence of both moral character and social readiness. A carefully executed pattern demonstrated diligence, attention to detail, and adherence to societal expectations. Quirky tidbit: some households created moral embroidery exercises where girls stitched abstract representations of virtues and vices. A wobbly stitch might indicate a lapse in concentration, or, according to some matrons, a lapse in moral focus. Imagine a young girl painstakingly embroidering temperance, only to notice her cat's tail brushing against the edge of her fabric, threatening the perfection of her work. Historians still argue whether such embroidery exercises genuinely instilled patience and moral development, or merely enforced a hyper-focus on meticulous conformity. While many girls developed impressive needlework, others may have internalized stress and fear of imperfection. A girl sits with her back straight, hands steady, as she threads the needle through linen. Each motion is precise, deliberate, a rhythmic meditation that occupies both mind and body. Her governess observes silently, noting tension in the shoulders, the steadiness of her breathing, and the perfection of each stitch. Even the soft tug of thread or slight slip is mentally catalogued as a reflection of composure and diligence. And here's a playful Victorian aside: some families incorporated tiny hidden motifs in practice cloths, challenging girls to embroider without noticing or altering them. One misinterpreted flower or crooked vine could be a minor scandal, or at least a source of whispered teasing among sisters. It's almost endearing to imagine young girls competing to see who could maintain composure, while secret squirrels or cats tested their focus. Animals, as ever, contributed silent evaluations. A dog sprawled beneath the table or a bird fluttering against the window could provoke either calm concentration or subtle panic. Maintaining composure amidst such distractions was considered a sign of refined character. Historians still debate whether embroidery as a purity test was a genuine avenue for skill building, or simply another layer of societal control over young women's attention and behavior. Yet the room hums with a quiet intensity, each stitch a small declaration of steadiness, patience, and virtue. As you watch the threads intertwine beneath careful fingers, forming delicate patterns that could last decades, it becomes clear that embroidery in Victorian times was never merely decorative. It was a subtle, persistent test of character, a measure of focus, patience, and moral fortitude, where every stitch silently reflected the expectations of an entire culture. You step into the etiquette room, where polished floors reflect the filtered sunlight streaming through lace curtains, and a faint aroma of lavender from a nearby sachet mixes with the lingering scent of waxed floors. Here the focus shifts from skill to behavior. Every gesture, every tilt of the head, every measured word becomes a subtle indicator of refinement, morality, and social preparedness. The girls practice bowing, curtsying, and polite conversation under the vigilant eyes of instructors and visiting relatives. Historical fact: Victorian society placed enormous emphasis on social etiquette as a measure of a young woman's worth. Mastery of manners, poise, and conversational grace was deemed essential for maintaining one's reputation and achieving marital prospects. Proper posture, measured speech, and the ability to navigate social situations with elegance were considered as morally significant as literacy or needlework. Quirky tidbit: some households devised elaborate etiquette drills where girls would be asked to greet a full room of family members, pets, and even visiting tradesmen, all in precise sequence. A dropped curtsy or a misaligned glance might earn a polite but pointed correction. One can imagine a girl simultaneously balancing nervous energy and the antics of a curious spaniel weaving through her skirts, an early test of multitasking grace. Historians still argue whether etiquette instruction cultivated genuine social competence or merely reinforced anxiety and obsession with appearances. While many young women excelled, others internalized fear of missteps, potentially shaping lifelong habits of self-consciousness. You watch a girl practice introducing herself, bowing gracefully, and delivering memorized pleasantries without a trace of hesitation. Each subtle movement, from the lift of a hand to the pitch of her voice, is under silent scrutiny. Even a sigh suppressed too sharply or a blink too long is mentally noted, as Victorian society insisted that composure and restraint reflected moral rectitude. A light-hearted detail: some families staged unexpected visitors' exercises where a sudden knock or a ringing bell required immediate composure. Girls had to adjust posture, mask surprise, and respond politely, all while maintaining a calm facial expression. This often resulted in frantic whispers and near-miss curtsies, though the overall goal was to teach adaptability under pressure. Animals predictably played their part. Cats leaping onto laps or birds hopping on windowsills became unintentional evaluators of patience and poise. Remaining unflustered amidst such distractions was considered evidence of inner stability. Historians still debate the true efficacy of these etiquette tests. Were they cultivating resilient, socially adept women, or merely training perfection under constant observation? Either way, the room thrums with quiet tension as grace, precision, and moral expectation intertwine. As you observe the measured movements, gentle smiles, and composed gestures, it becomes evident that Victorian etiquette was more than a series of rules. It was a subtle, pervasive test of character where every bow, curtsy, and turn of phrase quietly mirrored the societal ideals of discipline, virtue, and refinement. You wander down a narrow corridor into the music room, where the rich scent of polished wood and slightly musty sheet music drifts through the air, mingling with the faint note of candle wax. Sunlight glints off gleaming piano keys and the polished surface of a harp, casting elongated reflections across the parquet floor. Here, the purity tests take a melodic form. Girls are assessed not only on technical skill but on the grace, discipline, and emotional restraint demonstrated through music. Historical fact: musical education was central to Victorian female upbringing. Piano, harp, and singing were taught as markers of refinement and cultural literacy. Mastery of these instruments was considered evidence of patience, focus, and emotional cultivation, qualities associated with moral virtue. Performing correctly without emotional excess was paramount. A tremor in the voice or a misplayed note could suggest a lapse in composure or character. Quirky tidbit: in some households, young women were required to accompany imaginary audiences in mock concerts, responding to invisible applause or critiques. Some even practiced improvisation with a cat perched on the piano bench, which often led to unexpected musical interruptions, tiny scale crashes, or pause pressing random keys, a kind of secret test of adaptability and composure under distraction. Historians still argue whether musical instruction in this context encouraged genuine artistic expression or merely reinforced a strict adherence to societal expectations. Some women flourished, creating beautiful compositions and performances, while others felt confined, their emotional expressions tightly channeled to avoid any hint of impropriety. A girl perches on a piano bench her fingers gliding gracefully over the keys. Each note resonates softly, deliberately. The governess stands nearby, observing posture, fingering, and the subtle rise and fall of her chest. A single skipped beat or hesitation could be silently noted as evidence of distraction, impatience, or lack of poise. For a touch of Victorian humour, some teachers devised audience interruption exercises, where an assistant would cough, shuffle, or accidentally drop a book mid-performance. The goal was to see if the performer could maintain composure, continue flawlessly, and hide any hint of irritation, a skill deemed crucial for both musical and social mastery. Even the animals in the room serve as unintentional monitors. A curious dog, sniffing near the harpstrings, or a bird fluttering against the window, tests both patience and focus. Any sudden movement or distracted glance could be mentally recorded as a minor fault in moral vigilance. Historians still debate the broader purpose of musical purity tests. Were they cultivating resilience, discipline, and artistry, or merely reinforcing societal control over emotional expression? Regardless, the room hums with quiet tension, every note, pause, and rhythm a subtle measure of character. As you watch the girl play, the music flowing like a gentle river, you realize that each delicate key press, each carefully modulated chord, is more than sound. It is a silent, rigorous evaluation of grace, patience, and moral attentiveness, where artistry and virtue converge in a single melodic thread. You step into the literature room, where the air is thick with the musky scent of aged paper, ink, and faint candle smoke. Shelves creak under the weight of bound volumes, some gilded, some faded, their spines whispering secrets of centuries. Here, the purity tests take a mental form. Girls are assessed on reading comprehension, interpretation, and moral discernment, translating words into insight and judgment. Each paragraph they pass is not just a story, but a measure of intellect, discipline, and societal alignment. Historical fact: Victorian young women were often encouraged, or required, to read moralistic novels, poetry, and religious texts. Their ability to summarize, analyze, and discuss the material was seen as a reflection of intellect, propriety, and ethical grounding. Literacy was both a personal asset and a social obligation, signaling the potential to manage a household, educate children, and navigate social hierarchies. Quirky tidbit: some families conducted dramatic readings as part of the test, where girls would recite passages aloud, modulating tone and expression under scrutiny. One household encouraged readings to an audience of inanimate objects, a row of busts and porcelain dolls, so the girls' composure and expressive control were evaluated even without a human listener. Imagine a nervous teenager glaring at a marble philosopher as if he might snicker at a misplaced intonation. Historians still argue whether literature-based tests genuinely encouraged critical thinking or primarily reinforced adherence to moral and social norms. While some young women developed deep literary appreciation, others internalized anxiety, feeling their every interpretation could be judged morally as well as intellectually. You watch as a girl opens a well-worn novel, fingers tracing the edges of pages before settling into a passage on virtue, temptation, or domestic harmony. Each sentence is considered, mentally analyzed, and quietly judged for moral content. A slip of inflection during oral reading or a pause that lingers too long might hint at a distraction, or in Victorian logic, a lapse of ethical awareness. A touch of humour: some families introduced intentionally perplexing passages, mixing archaic language with obscure metaphors designed to fluster the reader while testing composure and focus. Girls occasionally stumbled over phrases like "the wainscot whispers of bygone deeds," prompting muffled giggles and secret smiles behind neatly clasped hands. Animals predictably maintained their subtle oversight. A cat brushing against the legs of a chair or a dog sighing in a corner tested both attention and patience. Remaining undistracted was considered a silent proof of moral and intellectual fortitude. Historians still debate whether these literary evaluations served genuine educational purposes or simply reinforced societal hierarchies. Regardless, the room vibrates with quiet intensity, where comprehension, judgment, and moral attentiveness intertwine. As you observe her fingers flipping pages and her eyes scanning lines with measured focus, it becomes clear that Victorian literature tests were more than academic exercises. Each carefully parsed sentence, each deliberate vocal inflection, is a subtle measure of character, intellect, and the ability to internalize and perform society's expectations with quiet grace. You wander into the garden room, a large conservatory filled with the mingling scents of blooming roses, citrus trees, and damp earth. Sunlight filters through latticed windows, casting intricate patterns across marble floors and wrought iron benches. Here, the purity tests extend beyond the parlor and needlework. Nature itself becomes a classroom, a space to observe, nurture, and understand the interconnectedness of life, all while demonstrating patience, attentiveness, and gentle discipline. Historical fact: Victorian girls were often taught botany and horticulture as part of their education. Cultivating plants, understanding seasonal cycles, and properly tending flowers or vegetables was seen as evidence of meticulousness, moral attentiveness, and the ability to manage responsibilities gracefully. A well-kept plant symbolized inner order and harmony with natural laws. Quirky tidbit: some households created miniature moral gardens, where each plant represented a virtue or vice. The daisies might symbolize innocence, the ivy loyalty, and a thorny rose cautionary wisdom. Girls were tasked with arranging and tending these symbolic gardens, and neglecting a plant was interpreted as a small but telling lapse in character. It's almost endearing to imagine a young girl whispering encouragements to her ivy as if it might respond. Historians still argue whether these botanical exercises fostered true understanding of nature or primarily reinforced symbolic associations designed to impress moral virtue onto young minds. The garden's beauty was secondary to the demonstration of diligence and conscientiousness. You watch a girl kneeling among rows of seedlings, her fingers gently brushing soil around roots, pruning tiny leaves with care. Each movement is deliberate, steady, and quiet. She is being evaluated not only for horticultural skill, but for her calmness, patience, and ability to maintain focus under the occasional intrusion of a wandering bird or a playful pet. A lightly humorous aside: some instructors introduced disruptive wildlife tests, allowing small birds or rabbits to move freely among the plants to see if girls could continue tending without flinching or shrieking. Imagine a rabbit nibbling a stray sprig of thyme while the young gardener maintained serene composure, fingers still delicately adjusting leaves elsewhere. Animals, as ever, are silent arbiters. Birds, rabbits, even a lazy cat, stretched across a sunlit bench, become unintentional monitors of patience and restraint. Remaining unflustered amidst these distractions is considered a subtle, practical proof of inner virtue. Historians still debate the educational versus moralizing function of Victorian gardens. Were they truly designed to teach life skills or primarily to instill obedience and careful observation? Either way, the room hums with quiet purpose, each leaf, bloom, and careful gesture a testament to cultivated attentiveness. As you observe her hands tending the soil, her eyes tracing the growth of tiny seedlings, it becomes clear that even something as simple as a garden was a stage for moral and personal assessment. Every measured step, every careful touch, quietly conveys the intricate dance between nature, discipline, and the Victorian ideal of feminine virtue. You slip into the embroidery room, where the muted scent of thread, fabric, and beeswax polish fills the air. Sunlight streams through stained glass windows, painting colored patterns onto delicate linens spread across polished tables. Here, every stitch, knot, and pattern becomes a tiny measure of diligence, patience, and attention to detail, qualities the Victorians equated with inner virtue and purity. Historical fact: needlework was a cornerstone of Victorian female education. Girls were expected to produce flawless samplers, intricate lace, and decorative pieces that showcased not just technical skill, but moral refinement. Sloppy stitches could imply carelessness, a subtle threat to a girl's perceived character and future prospects in society. Quirky tidbit: in some households, girls were challenged with blindfolded embroidery tests, where they had to replicate a pattern from memory or by touch alone. Some records suggest that one young woman accidentally sewed her hair into the fabric, earning both laughter and gentle admonishment, an amusing reminder that these exercises were rigorous, yet occasionally chaotic. Historians still argue whether these embroidery tests genuinely prepared women for domestic responsibilities or served primarily as a means to enforce social conformity. For many girls, the lessons lingered, not just in skill, but in the anxiety of perfection and the subtle scrutiny that accompanied every hand movement. You watch as a girl holds a tiny needle, her fingers moving with meticulous precision across an intricate floral pattern. Her eyes, narrowed in concentration, track each stitch. Even the faintest slip, a misplaced loop or a slightly uneven line, is mentally noted, though rarely called out aloud. This silent accountability underscores the pervasive nature of Victorian testing. Observation and judgment are constant companions. A touch of humour, some instructors would hide small challenges within the embroidery, a stray bead, a slightly darker thread, to test problem-solving, attention, and composure under pressure. Girls often whispered to themselves, navigating these tiny obstacles as if each were a miniature moral dilemma. Animals predictably remained subtle observers. A cat curling in a sunny corner, a small bird pecking at crumbs near a window ledge, or a dog stretching lazily across the floor tests patience and focus indirectly. Any sudden distraction or exclamation might be remembered as evidence of a lapse in calm decorum. Historians still debate the broader implications of these needlework exercises. Did they cultivate practical skills and mindfulness, or merely instill perfectionism and social anxiety? Regardless, the room hums with concentrated energy, each stitch a testament to careful observation, moral attentiveness, and delicate skill. As you watch the thread pass through fabric, fingers deftly maneuvering, it becomes clear that Victorian embroidery was more than craft. Each tiny stitch, each careful decision silently measured patience, character, and composure, a quiet, woven reflection of the society that shaped it. You enter the final chamber, the observatory of comportment, where the soft tick of a gilded clock marks each measured second. The room is vast but sparsely furnished, dominated by high-backed chairs, long tables, and mirrors angled to catch every posture and movement. Here, the ultimate test unfolds, a cumulative evaluation of everything learned, manners, discipline, artistry, patience, and moral attentiveness, all distilled into one prolonged observation of presence, poise, and subtle conduct. Historical fact: Victorian finishing schools often concluded with comprehensive assessments of character and decorum, combining lessons in music, literature, needlework, and conversation. The goal was to ensure that young women could navigate social interactions gracefully, demonstrating the proper blend of intellect, morality, and aesthetic sensibility. Quirky tidbit: some schools implemented mirror walks, where a girl would traverse the rooms slowly while silently imagining every observer, real or imagined, analyzing each step, tilt of the head, or hand gesture. Rumor has it that one particularly mischievous girl carried a small parasol while performing, insisting it was for dramatic effect, leaving teachers unsure whether to admire her ingenuity or scold the audacity. Historians still debate whether these final assessments reflected genuine character development or merely rehearsed performance skills. Some argue that the intense focus on presentation and controlled behavior could cultivate confidence and social ease, while others contend it reinforced rigid conformity and the pressure to maintain an unbroken veneer of propriety. You watch as a girl steps forward, hands lightly clasped in front, eyes meeting the room's reflections with quiet assurance. Every breath, every glance, every subtle shift in stance is evaluated, though silently, and with the same meticulous attention that accompanied all prior lessons. The room seems to stretch in time. Each measured second feels longer, heavier, imbued with the weight of expectations that have built over years. A light-hearted aside, occasionally instructors would introduce minor distractions, soft coughing, a book dropped, or a whisper from an adjacent hallway to see if the subject could maintain composure. The ability to remain unaffected, calm, and precise was the ultimate mark of refinement. Animals, once more, play their unobtrusive role. A cat padding along the windowsill or a bird chirping in the rafters provides gentle, unpredictable tests of serenity. Remaining poised despite these intrusions becomes a subtle but telling measure of the girl's cultivated patience and attentiveness. Historians still argue whether these comprehensive evaluations produced well-rounded women or finely tuned actors. Regardless, the room hums with a quiet, almost sacred intensity, where every gesture, glance, and breath is a testament to Victorian ideals of femininity and discipline. As you step back, observing the culmination of lessons, patterns, and subtle tests, the mosaic of training comes together. Music, literature, gardens, embroidery, and comportment all were threads woven into the fabric of character, shaping young women in ways both visible and invisible, gentle and exacting. Now the pace softens. You sink into a chair, letting your shoulders relax, and allow the images of gilded rooms, sun-dappled gardens, and delicate embroidery to drift like clouds across your mind. The ticking of clocks, the faint whisper of candle flames, and the gentle rustle of silk and paper merge into a soothing rhythm. All around, quiet diligence and patient attentiveness linger in your thoughts, not as demands, but as echoes of another era, a time when subtlety and observation shaped daily life in ways we can barely imagine today. The tension eases, replaced by gentle curiosity, as if each room you've wandered through breathes softly, exhaling a story long told. You picture girls tending plants, tracing thread, reading lines, playing notes, each motion deliberate, careful, and quietly graceful. There is no rush here, only the slow unfolding of lives, rituals, and lessons, all captured in the soft glow of memory. Take a slow breath and feel the stillness that pervades these halls. Even the smallest movement, a turning page, a plucked string, a bent stem, carries a whisper of purpose. Allow it to settle over you. The soft cadence of an era defined by patience, attentiveness, and gentle discipline. You probably won't survive a full Victorian school day, but you can carry the essence, the calm awareness, the observation of beauty, the quiet humor in small disruptions, and the delicate interplay of expectation and personal grace. Let it all fade slowly into the quiet spaces behind your eyes. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let these images dissolve gently into your dreams. The distant echoes of piano keys, whispered readings, and stitched patterns fade into a comforting lullaby. Tonight you leave the past behind with a soft smile and the slow, even rhythm of peace.